Hi, my name is Andrzej Olejniczak from University of Opole. In this short blog entry, I'd like to actually talk about corpus linguistics. It is a topic that I am dealing with in my PhD thesis. It is also something that I do believe is universally interesting since it deals with texts and with language, and languages all around us. So there are so many different applications of corpora. So before we get started, the important thing is, of course, to discuss what a corpus and corpus linguistics even are. So a corpus, according to definition, is a set of texts collected or put together due to very specific criteria, right? So it is basically something that someone would like to study from a particular angle. Therefore, they collect texts that are concerned with that particular area and they analyze them through different statistical means. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that first of all, the definition of text is very broad. So when you think text, it doesn't necessarily even have to be written, it can be spoken, right? There are several spoken corpora, so you can actually analyze the actual use of language as people speak it, right? So there are quite a few different ways of approaching those texts then. There are also, of course, things that are social media posts, right? So you can also try to approach those as texts, right? Since they do contain samples of language. There are also, of course, those traditional notions, right, such as, for instance, texts of books, texts of articles in newspapers, right? There are so many different things that you can analyze and that you can treat as components of a corpus that honestly, there is no end to possibilities almost. Corpus linguistics analyzes texts, analyzes corpora, looking at those statistical details, right? So corpus linguistics is indeed mostly interested in the quantitative studies. It carries out those different studies that are concerned with how exactly the words operate within the context, how exactly the words go together with other words. It looks at how perhaps the word frequencies are in the text. It can also compare two larger corpora with one another given their characteristics. There are so many different things that can be done, and all of them actually can really enhance the existing state of knowledge about many of the fields and disciplines that are concerned with language and with text. The interesting thing, however, is that a quantitative study can also aid a qualitative research based project. So if you're trying to conduct something that is mostly focused on close reading and on some other more hands-on means of experiencing texts, you can still apply corpus linguistics nonetheless, since, well, it facilitates most of those studies. Tries what perhaps corpus linguistics can do, for instance, is it can give you a unique point of view on the text that you have already analyzed via close reading. Because what you might not be able to see with a naked eye becomes sometimes blatantly obvious as you analyze it through statistical means. And this can, of course, enhance your analysis, give you an additional angle, and honestly just give you so many new openings to pursue. So this particular entry is not necessarily going to go in depth about how to do corpus linguistics, because that would take way too much time, and I only have 10 minutes. What I'd like to do today is actually to walk you through some of the studies that applied corpora and applied corpus linguistics to achieve their ends. Those are, I would mostly consider those even transdisciplinary studies. Some of them are interdisciplinary, and they really apply corpus linguistics in innovative and cool ways that are not necessarily the way you would expect a corpus linguistics study to be carried out. So this is perhaps one of the most interesting studies, and it is concerned with the language of depression. Now, psychology has been actually using the findings of corpus linguistics for quite a while now. They carried out studies, for instance, in couples therapy. So they actually looked at how exactly the language of arguing people would either display the features that would perhaps entail that people are seeking to agree with one another, and it would perhaps also sometimes show where people would be not very eager to be on the same page. Now, this particular study is a bit different because it deals with a far more, I would perhaps claim it's a more serious issue, which is depression. So the research question that Almozawi and Johnstone posed was that, they're actually trying to find out if the language of people who exhibit the symptoms of depression, does stand out from the crowd. So, and perhaps if it does, what sort of things do the people with depression say that the other people don't, right? What they did is basically that's, I think, a very interesting method as well. So they took posts from 64 mental health forums from around 64,000 patients who were posting on these forums, and they're trying to actually look for certain features of their language that would stand out from a control group. What they did indeed discover is that there is a category of words that becomes increasingly prevalent depending on what sort of anxiety disorders or related problems a person is dealing with. So it turned out that basically the so-called absolutist words would occur about 50% more often in the people who were struggling with depression and anxiety, and approximately 80% more often in people with suicidal ideation, which I do believe is a very, very significant difference from the norm, right? So those are absolutist words are the words such as always, nothing, completely, and the such. So the words that basically provide you with those kind of ultimate notions, right? You have the list on the right. If you'd like to, you can pause the video and just have a look. But what they essentially did show is that this is the graphed out difference, right? The difference in so between the control group, which did not exhibit any of those issues, and the groups that were actually affected by those factors were significant, right? You can see that those are almost twofold differences in the number of absolutist words used by the people with suicidal ideation, and about like 50-40% more in people with anxiety and depression. So that's, I think, a very, very interesting finding, and it really shows how much of a potential the corpus linguistics does have in aiding those other disciplines. And we're going to change the angle a little bit here and have a look at something drastically different from our study of depression, which is how exactly the myths around Shakespeare can be dismantled. So this is something that is perhaps more inching towards the literary studies. And this is, again, something that has been done quite a lot these days, right? People will actually approach those classics. People will take a look at the works of, for instance, Jane Austen. They have a look at the works of Shakespeare, and they try to actually find some interesting facts about those that might have been omitted by the scholars who approached those pieces of art via more traditional means. In this case, Craig is actually looking at how certain myths surrounding the existence of Shakespeare were shaped, and how exactly those could perhaps be proven or dismantled. So what he's trying to do in this particular study is he's trying to actually work with the notion that Shakespeare's dictionary was the biggest among the playwrights of his time. And he does actually bring up the piece of data here that does, in a sense, show that Shakespeare's dictionary was perhaps the biggest. So when you look at the y-axis here, you can see that perhaps, and you actually compare Shakespeare's work against the others, you can quite clearly see that he did indeed use the highest number of different words overall. But as you actually try to have a look at something else and zoom in on the x-axis, you notice something more. Shakespeare was not only the person who used the most unique words overall, but he was also the person who used the most words overall, because he was one of the most productive playwrights of his time. Not one of the most, he was actually the most productive playwright. What this means is that even though Shakespeare did actually use the highest number of words overall that would be different from one another, he would also use, well, perhaps not so many words on average. So what this study did is actually took samples of 10,000 words from the plays of Shakespeare, essentially looking at the first 10,000 words of plays of all those playwrights from Shakespearean period. And this study did actually then compare and try to rank those authors given their average numbers of unique words per 10,000 running words in the corpus. What happened is that Shakespeare got severely deranked here. It turns out that the most unique vocabulary was actually exhibited by Webster, followed by Dekker, Peel, Marlowe, and Johnson. And Shakespeare ranks 7, not the first on the list, which basically does deal with this particular myth that has been basically repeated by, among other things, the Norton Anthology of English literature. So there are quite a few very prominent sources that were basically circulating that myth that have essentially been debunked by a corpus study, which I also do find quite cool indeed. Okay, we're back with a somewhat more of a gloomy topic in forensic linguistics, which is a branch of linguistics dealing with crime. We are looking at the study conducted by two researchers from Wrocław in Poland, from University of Wrocław and from the University of Technology in Wrocław. So these two researchers have actually examined, or have been examining, because this is one of the many studies of theirs, the notion of fake and genuine suicide notes. So what they're trying to actually do is they're trying to verify or trying to look for ways to test whether a note, a suicide note that was written by someone, was written genuinely, or whether it is something that was either faked by the writer themselves or by somebody else. And their methods, I think, are really, really interesting as well. So what they did is they collected 614 genuine suicide notes from the years 1998 to 2008. Those notes were, of course, in Polish. And they created a corpus, a database of notes based on that. What they did later was that they actually had to come up with an experiment that would produce a reliable corpus of fake notes. So what they did is actually quite I think this is one of the coolest solutions to a problem I've ever seen. So what they did is that they basically collected 117 notes through an experiment. They asked participants to basically pretend they were writing a suicide note. They're writing a fake suicide note. And it was not in their own name, but on behalf of an imaginary person whose characteristics were presented to the participants. So basically, those people were producing those fake suicide notes, and they were doing so while thinking about a particular other person. So this would perhaps allow us to tell the difference between a suicide note that is, original and the one that was made up. And what is interesting here are quite a few things that set those fake and real suicide notes apart. So those fake notes would use concrete words less frequently, and they would use the abstract words such as problem, sense, or situation way more frequently than the real suicide notes. They would also not use the second person pronouns, referring to the recipient directly. So if a note would address the recipient directly, it would be more likely for it to be actually genuine rather than fake. And there were some other lexical things. So for instance, the intensifier bardzo, which is this very basic intensifier in Polish, meaning very, right, would occur 30% of the time in genuine notes and 18% of the time in the counterfeited notes, right? There were certain terms of endearment, right, that Polish uses, such as żabko and kochany, right, which would also be less likely to be found in the fake notes. Eventually, there would also be the notion of those valuation words related to emotion, feelings, and memory and imagination, and would once again be less frequent in those fake notes as well. I think that was, again, a very, very interesting study overall, and it did show that, a corpus can really show you or highlight certain features of a text that would not be that visible to the naked eye. Now, that analysis carried out by Zaśko, Zieliński, and Piasecki would also encompass some other paratextual factors, right? So they would also consider the way in which the layout of the text was situated on the page, and so on and so forth. I highly encourage you to have a look at their paper. Now we're going to move on to the last bit. Okay, and the very, very last bit that I wanted to discuss is actually something that I'm doing myself. So this is my own study. I am by no means comparing the innovativeness of those studies to mine, but I still think this one is very interesting nonetheless. So in my study, I'm actually trying to have a look at native and translated texts. And I'm trying to compare the texts that were written in Polish to the texts that were indeed translated into Polish. To that end, I created two corpora, so one kind of database of texts that were natively written in Polish, that all of those texts are literary fiction, by the way, and the other corpus is that of translations into Polish from English, which is, by the way, quite a relevant thing in the end. So the results that you can see over here were basically produced by an algorithm that carried out cluster analysis, basically grouping texts based on certain features that those texts do exhibit. As can be quite clearly seen, these texts in green are mostly grouped on a singular branch, meaning that they are indeed exhibiting similar features, while the red texts are also grouped on a separate branch, meaning that they do exhibit separate features too. Now, the green texts are translations, and the red texts are native texts, which means that there are certain things that basically distinguish those two groups, right? There are, of course, some outliers in two texts that we can see here, but generally speaking, these results do show that some of those large differences occur between translations and native texts, which are basically created in the same language in the end. So I just wanted to bring up two of those kind of bigger things, the biggest kind of features that do make these texts stand out. First one of those is the so-called verbs of speaking. So when a dialogue is narrated, as character utters words, there is going to be usually a verb that goes, for instance, said, uttered, mentioned, asked, responded, and so on and so forth. Those are the so-called verbs of speaking. Now, English traditionally uses very simple words of speaking, such as I've already mentioned, said, answered, and asked. Polish is a little bit different in that regard. Polish uses perhaps words that are way more different. It uses way more synonyms because Polish hates repetition. It also very often doesn't use any words of speaking at all in the dialogues themselves. That is the native Polish. Because what happens in translation is that those features of English actually interfere and become the features of translated Polish, which means that the translated Polish dialogues differ significantly from the ones that are actually produced natively in Polish. And it's also important to know, these are works that are literary, so those are things that are translated by very highly trained and skilled professionals who should not be kind of doing this. Yet, the source language does influence and impact the final product of translation to a significant degree. Another very interesting thing that is a little bit, I think, harder to find is the notion of the so-called implied subject. As you probably know, an English sentence does require to have the so-called overt subject. So a subject that is visible on the surface level of a sentence. So for instance, we can have a sentence such as Jarek went shopping, with Jarek being our subject. In Polish, we can say Jarek poszedł na zakupy, which is basically a normal sentence in Polish, but Polish doesn't necessarily need to mention Jarek. This is because our Polish verbs take the endings that basically tell us about the gender of the subject, which means that our verb can essentially serve as both a subject and the main verb of the sentence. So in our second example over here, poszedł na zakupy, this is still a valid sentence in Polish, where you can clearly note that there is no verb, and in English it would read went shopping, which is of course not grammatical. Now, Polish does it very often, right? When we are producing sentences in Polish, we very often skip the subject altogether. This actually means that as a person is translating from English into Polish, they might be influenced by the necessity of having a visible overt subject, and they might not change the sentences to contain an implied subject instead. This does indeed happen very often, meaning that certain translated texts will carry over the features of English into their Polish versions, which of course means that the readers who are interacting with those texts are not necessarily receiving the texts that are, as native as they perhaps should have been. Now, this is it. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope you enjoyed this very short overview of what corpus linguistics can accomplish. You can obviously, if you're interested in my work, you can check out my profile on ResearchGate, and that will be it. Thank you very much, and I hope you did indeed enjoy your time.